Well, welcome back to this third and final part of Introduction to Digital Photography. In this episode, we're going to be looking at white balance, we're going to be looking at ISO, and we're going to look at the benefits of shooting RAW over shooting JPEGs. So, without further ado, we'll get straight into it. The first thing we're going to look at today is white balance, and you'll notice on your camera you'll have some presets on there for various settings called flash, tungsten, daylight sunny, daylight cloudy, daylight shade, fluorescent. They may be called something slightly different on yours, but that's generally the settings that there are. Now, when we are surrounded by light of a specific colour temperature, say like room lights, our eyes will adjust fairly quickly to that colour temperature, and we will in effect filter out the colour cast created by the light source. So even if we're looking at, say, a white object under the yellow glow of tungsten, we'll see that object as white. Now, digital cameras can't achieve the same effect as that. We have to give them a bit of help, and that's why the presets are here. So, if you walk into, say, a modern office building, and you say you're going to photograph somebody, maybe the manager or whoever, the chances are that office is probably going to be illuminated by, say, fluorescent tubes. Now, fluorescent tubes under with your camera set on daylight will come out a cyan to green colour, which is not very pleasing for skin tone. So back in the days of film, we would have to use special filters in front of the lens to try and counterbalance that fluorescent cast, which could be a bit tricky because all the fluorescent tubes were never exactly the same, so it was always a bit of trial and error. These days, of course, we've got shooting digital, we've got these presets and everything's a bit easier. Now, I'm talking here about shooting JPEGs, where you really have to be a little bit more careful at the shooting stage. Now, I shoot RAW file formats, and we'll talk about a bit more about RAW and JPEGs a bit later on. But I shoot RAW, so I tend to leave my camera on daylight, and I tend to process and adjust the white balance when I process the images, which gives me a bit more control. So this really applies more if you're shooting JPEGs than RAW. Now, of course, if you are shooting JPEGs and you haven't got the white balance dead right, it's not the end of the world. You can still adjust the colours, but it's better for quality-wise to do that before you shoot if you're shooting JPEGs. Now, this image here is just a snapshot, really, done in a hotel room in Spain. It's actually my daughter, and the walls this is predominantly lit by daylight. This image, you can see from this side, the lights coming in to her to the left here, but the walls of the hotel room were very, very warm, which is again the daylight's bouncing off those walls and giving quite a warm effect. So I'm just going to run through some of the presets. I've actually changed this image using different presets, so you can just have a look at the difference in each one. So this one is actually the image with a flash preset, which is warm the image up a little bit. Flash tends to be very cool, a cold light source, so that just warms up the image slightly. The next image I put on tungsten, you can see straight away that's gone very, very cool. I don't dislike this image. This reminds me of the old cross-processing days when we used to take certain films and develop them in the wrong chemicals. You get some very strong and very weird effects, especially very popular with fashion photographers. So this is what I'm getting at. It's about making choices, having control and making choices. This one's set on daylight. You can see that's still pretty warm. That is probably the best setting for this particular image because it is lit by daylight. But as I said, because that daylight is bounced off warm walls, we're getting a bit of a colour cast, and so the image has gone fairly warm on that one. This one's cloudy, that's gone warmer still. Obviously on a cloudy day the light tends to be a bit cool, so again it's kind of a warming filter. And finally we've got again shade, which is warmer again still. Obviously on a sunny day, if you're shooting in shade, again the light tends to be rather cool. And this is our final one. This is actually fluorescent. And actually, that's probably more neutral than the daylight one. And again, I'll say it again, this image was shot on daylight, but because of the light bounced off the walls, it did warm the picture up quite a bit. So it's not all straightforward as you might think. You need to be aware of your environment and where the light is bouncing around from. Obviously, if you've got bright green walls, then your image is going to come out with a green cast. So another benefit of shooting RAW, which again we will be going on to a little bit later on to talk about. So just like f-stops and shutter speeds, white balance can be another personal choice. It can be a creative choice, as I've shown here. So just bear that in mind. It's another option open to you. You could just prefer your images very neutral. Most of the time, a little bit of warmth in pictures doesn't hurt. If you showed two people or a bunch of people some images, one being slightly warm and one being slightly cooler, I almost guarantee you they'll accept the slightly warmer one, but they'll pick up on the cooler picture straight away. So it's always worth remembering that. We're now going to move on to ISO or ASA if you're from old school, you're shooting film back in the day. Now, ISO is a measure of how sensitive the digital camera's sensor will be to light. The higher the number, the more rapidly it will react to and therefore record light flowing through the lens. So, just like f-stops and shutter speeds, each increase in ISO, say 100 to 200, equals a stop. So the higher the number, the more rapidly the camera will react to the light. So if you were shooting in a really kind of dark room handheld, and you know that your shutter speed was getting too low to handhold, and you're going to get camera shake, which we covered in an earlier episode, then your probably only option possibly is to increase the ISO. Now, say you were shooting on 100 ISO and you've got an exposure of 1/60th at f8. Now, you decide you actually want a smaller aperture. You want to go down to f16 because you want to get a bit more depth of field, a bit more sharpness throughout the picture. What you could do is to move up to 400 ISO, which gives you 2 stops increase in sensitivity and so extra light. And that gives you 2 stops extra exposure. So now you can shoot at 1/60th at f16. Now you're probably thinking, well, why do I ever need to take a tripod with me again? I'll just put my ISO on 1600, and I'll have fast enough shutter speeds and probably deep enough apertures to shoot whatever I want. Well, there's a trade-off. When you move the ISO up to say 1600, you'll get thing called noise in your images. Now, back when we were shooting film, I know I keep referring to it, this was known as grain, and you could actually buy film of high ASA, like 1000 ASA, and actually shoot for that effect. So it's a little bit annoying these days when people talk about noise. It's almost like a dirty word, and I don't think that's so much the case. It's very hard to get grainy pictures or very noisy pictures out of digital cameras, and sometimes I'll actually add extra noise into my pictures if I want that kind of effect. So don't be afraid of noise in your images. It is very fine these days anyway, and sometimes it's quite nice. So here's a few pictures. This is actually a picture I took many years ago on a film called 1000 RS. It was made by Agfa, and you can see even at this small size the grain coming through there. And it was just a really nice film. I took lots and lots of pictures on this type of film. This is actually a digital picture, and I actually cropped into the image. It was a bit of a grab shot. I was walking along, I saw this bird hidden, and I knew as I approached it would take off. So I upped my ISO on the camera as high as I could, I needed, and took the picture. And not being content with that, I actually cropped into the picture and added some extra noise in there. Is another picture. You can see the noise in the background here. So all I'm trying to say is, if it's a difference between getting a picture and not getting a picture, just up your ISO and shoot it. There is third-party plugins and also filters within Photoshop that will help you get rid of noise. It's better not to have it in the first place if you don't want it, but there's always options there. And as I said, it's all never as bad as some people make out. As I said, noise is painted with a bit of a dirty word, and I would say just get out there, stick your camera on the highest ISO setting and have a bit of a play around, and you might find you actually quite like the effect. Finally, to finish off with, we're going to be talking about file formats. Now, if you're fairly new to digital photography, the chances are you're shooting JPEGs, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But if you want to take your photography to the next level and have more control and the best quality from your camera, you need to be shooting raw file formats. Now, what is a raw file format? Well, a raw file is a little bit like a negative from a colour print film. It's a intermediate stage, whereas if you shot a JPEG or a transparency film, you would have like a immediate finished article. With RAW, you've got to do a little bit more work on it, and it's best thought of as like a negative. A raw image is actually not an image at all. It's actually a data file, a set of instructions, and you'll open that up in a bit of software like Photoshop or other raw processing software, some of which are free, and you then have to basically develop that file. The upshot of shooting RAW is you've got more control. You've got more control over colour, exposure and sharpness, etc. And of course white balance, which we talked about earlier. It is the highest quality you can get from your camera. And finally, the dynamic range is much better than shooting JPEG. So you've got that little bit more range of tones from light to dark. Now, RAW versus JPEG. Let's just go through some of the pros and cons of JPEGs. Now, the pros of JPEGs are there's no extra work needed. You shoot it, and the image is finished. It's all done in camera. You can then offload it and upload it to the web or print it out, and the job's done. It's immediately available for printing, sharing, posting to the web. So it does not need lots of storage. JPEGs are generally compressed. You can usually choose the amount of compression you want. So they store quite nice and small on your computer or on a DVD. The cons of JPEGs is the quality is not as good as a RAW file. All the camera settings are set in camera at the time of shooting. That's not particularly a bad thing, but you know, if you want a little bit more control, you can with RAW you can obviously make a lot more of those decisions later when you develop the file. So there's a little bit less control over the image look. Now, again, that's not entirely true, but what I'm getting at is that when you go and start manipulating a JPEG file, maybe changing the colours, the exposure especially, you're going to start damaging the file, and therefore the quality suffers. It's less forgiving with exposure errors, and finally, it's less dynamic range within the file. So as I mentioned earlier, with RAW you've got that little bit more dynamic range. We're just going to quickly look at the pros and cons for RAW, and you know, I am repeating some of this again, but I don't think it'll do any harm. So some of the pros of RAW: it's the most versatile format, and you have more control over your image, and that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about having control and be able to be more creative with our picture taking. So this is the file format best for that. You can retrieve overexposed images, as we spoke about earlier, but only to a degree. You can't go overexposing by 6 stops and expect to still be able to process it and retrieve that. That's just far too much. But certain amounts, depending on the actual the scene you're photographing, you can retrieve some overexposure. It's got a better dynamic range, so you've got more tones from dark to light, and it's the best format for utmost quality. So if you want the best from your camera, RAW's the way to go. And of course you can export your files, you can process them and export them to things like JPEGs and TIFFs as well. So you're not sort of not having JPEGs. You can still have your JPEGs and post them to the web, etc. It just means you've got to develop and output them. A few of the cons of shooting RAW: well, the obvious one is you've got extra work to do. You come back and you offload your images and you still got to develop them, but it's a small sacrifice to pay for the extra quality. You do need a little bit more storage. JPEGs are obviously compressed. RAWs are actually compressed as well, I believe, in a lossless format, but they're not going to be as smaller files as JPEGs. So you do need that little bit extra storage with them. And that's about it. So as you can probably tell, I'm very for shooting RAW, and I think you should too. I think there's too many benefits and not enough negatives, if you pardon the pun, to not shooting RAW files. Is there a situation where I shoot shoot JPEGs? Well, yes. I mean, just recently I finished a shoot on location. It was a week-long shoot, and at the end of every shoot a day, I had to upload the images straight to my client's server, and they were processed overnight and went on their website. And rather than, because of my exposures were all pretty consistent, rather than shooting RAW and have to process several hundred images at the end of the day, I decided the JPEGs would work fine. Now, what I did, I actually shot RAW and JPEGs simultaneously, so I still had a RAW file as well to fall back on, because I know certain clients will come back to me several months or even a year later and want a higher res or a better quality image. Even if they say they don't need them, chances are they'll come back and ask me for it. So I shot RAW to archive, and the JPEGs are the ones I uploaded that evening. So there is those situations, and the same in if you're a press photographer, you haven't got time to be messing around with RAW files. I wouldn't think so. I would think most of the press guys shoot JPEGs, and sports photographers. But on the whole, if you're out there shooting, my advice is shoot RAW, or if not, shoot RAW and JPEG simultaneously, and you can always delete what you don't need later on. So that concludes this video tutorial, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learnt some of the fundamentals of digital photography from this, and I hope you'll move on from this and start to get more creative and take control of your camera and start shooting some really creative images. Until the next time, I thank you for watching. Cheers.